There is a type of person who spends most of life feeling misplaced. Not lost, misplaced, too serious for small talk, too reflective for fast success, too independent to fully belong, yet too aware to escape society entirely. These people often believe they are late to life until something unexpected happens. Time stops working against them, while others peak early and slowly defend what they built. This person begins to expand. Their voice steadies, their decisions become final, their tolerance for nonsense disappears, and strangely, life begins to respond. Machiavelli noticed this pattern long before modern psychology named it. He observed that some psyches are structured for delayed authority. They gather weight slowly, almost invisibly, until a threshold is crossed. Before that threshold, they struggle. After it, they become immovable. This isn't growth in the usual sense. It's compression finally releasing. If you are entering your 50s and feel calmer but more dangerous, if you no longer chase relevance, yet feel more relevant than ever, if you sense that your real work is only now becoming possible, then this is not the end of your arc. It is the point where your life finally begins to make sense. For most of your life, the world trained you to misunderstand yourself. You were measured against timelines that rewarded speed, clarity, and early commitment. By those standards, you appeared inefficient. You hesitated when others advanced. You questioned when others complied. And over time, a quiet suspicion formed that perhaps you were failing at life in some subtle but irreversible way. Machiavelli would have said this suspicion was not accidental. He believed that society unconsciously pressures certain individuals to abandon their natural rhythm, and those who resist consciously or not are often the very ones whose psyche is not designed for early crystallization. Some personalities cannot solidify early without breaking. From a Jungian perspective, the rare personality is born unusually close to the unconscious. This means their inner world is crowded, symbolic, contradictory, and alive. They do not experience thoughts as linear instructions. They experience them as living tensions. This creates friction with reality from the beginning. Where others feel certainty, you feel complexity. Where others feel motivation, you feel doubt. Where others choose quickly, you sense consequences that haven't happened yet. This is not indecision, it is depth processing. But depth processing is invisible, and what is invisible is often judged as absence. So early life becomes a struggle, not because you lack ability, but because your psyche refuses to simplify itself for survival alone. You are not wired to accept borrowed identities. You need coherence, not just function. Machiavelli believed the first half of life is about building an ego strong enough to face the world. But he warned that if the ego forms too quickly, it becomes rigid, and rigid structures cannot hold contradiction. Your ego formed slowly, because it had to remain flexible enough to contain opposing forces. Light and shadow, ambition and restraint, meaning and absurdity. This delay had a cost. You likely experienced exhaustion that made no sense. You could rest and still feel tired. You could achieve something and feel nothing. You could move forward and feel as if you were betraying yourself. This is what happens when the psyche refuses premature alignment. The world calls it laziness. Psychology calls it depression. Machiavelli called it misdirected life energy. Your energy was not meant to be spent yet. It was being conserved, while others were externalizing, building status, reputation, certainty. You were internalizing, watching, absorbing, testing values against lived reality rather than ideology. You were learning what doesn't work, and this knowledge accumulates slowly, but it does not decay. This is why early success would have been dangerous for you, had you locked into a role. To Machiavelli, you would have outgrown it violently. You would have woken up one day with everything society promised, and none of what your soul required. Many people do that. Collapse usually comes later. Yours came early in fragments across years, and that made it survivable. Jung believed nature is economical. If a psyche delays gratification, it is because immediate gratification would interfere with a deeper objective. The rare personality is not optimized for efficiency. It is optimized for integration. Integration takes time because it requires conflict. You had to encounter false paths. You had to experience disillusionment. You had to sit with unanswered questions longer than most people can tolerate. This is why your early life felt heavier. You were not building momentum. You were building tolerance for ambiguity. And ambiguity is the price of wisdom. As life progresses, something subtle begins to shift. The pressure to become something dissolves. The fear of missing out weakens. The urgency that once pushed you outward starts turning inward. This is not withdrawal. It is preparation for consolidation. Jung believed that the psyche does not mature linearly. It matures in phases, and for certain individuals, the phase of expansion is postponed because the phase of excavation must come first. You were digging while others were displaying, and when the second half of life begins, the ground you cleared becomes visible, not as regret but as foundation. There comes a point, usually somewhere between the late 40s and early 50s, when the old struggle loses its grip. Not because life becomes easier, but because the conflict changes location. For most people, midlife feels like collapse. The goals that once organized their existence lose meaning. The identities they built early begin to feel narrow, even fraudulent. Machiavelli called this the revenge of the unlived life, the return of everything that was postponed, denied or suppressed. But for you, this phase does not arrive as a shock. You have been living with that tension for years. While others were consolidating identities, you were dismantling assumptions. While they were reinforcing roles, you were questioning the structure beneath them. So when the second half of life approaches, you are not confronted by emptiness. You are confronted by clarity. The frantic pressure to arrive somewhere begins to dissolve. The anxiety of choosing the right path fades, not because you found certainty, but because you stopped believing certainty was required. This is a critical psychological shift. Machiavelli believed that the first half of life is ruled by expansion, by outward adaptation, ambition, and social alignment. But the second half demands the opposite: contraction, meaning, and internal coherence. Most people resist this turn. You don't because contraction feels familiar to you. You've already lived there. What changes now is not your depth but your orientation. For the first time, your inner world stops competing with external reality. Instead of feeling like an obstacle, it becomes an instrument. The very traits that once slowed you, reflection, restraint, sensitivity to contradiction, begin to produce accuracy. Your decisions become slower but final. Your speech becomes sparse but weighted. Your tolerance for noise diminishes, but your tolerance for complexity expands. Machiavelli described this phase as individuation, the process by which a person becomes what they actually are rather than what they were expected to be. Individuation does not make life louder. It makes it quieter and more exact. You begin to notice that you are no longer easily impressed. Titles lose their magnetism. Social performance becomes transparent. You can see when something is hollow almost immediately. This is not cynicism, it is pattern recognition. Years of observing without participating fully have trained your perception. You learned how people signal competence without possessing it. How systems reward appearance over substance. How narratives replace truth. This is why you no longer rush. You know where speed leads. Another shift occurs during this phase. Your relationship with failure changes. Earlier in life, failure felt personal, like confirmation that you were misaligned or inadequate. Now it feels informational. Failure no longer threatens your identity because your identity is no longer provisional. Machiavelli believed that once a person stops identifying with roles, they become difficult to destabilize. Criticism loses its sting. Praise loses its grip. You are no longer negotiating your existence through reaction. You are responding from structure. This is also when your past stops haunting you. The choices that once felt wasted reveal their function. Detours become training. Losses become refinements. Periods of isolation become necessary incubations. Nothing feels accidental anymore. Not because everything worked out, but because everything contributed. This realization produces a calm that others mistake for detachment. But it is not detachment, it is integration. You are no longer split between who you are and who you think you should have been. This is dangerous because a person who no longer needs to become something cannot be manipulated by promise or threat. They are not seduced by status, nor intimidated by authority. They operate according to internal alignment rather than external reward. Machiavelli believed such individuals often emerge as stabilizing forces during periods of uncertainty, not because they seek leadership, but because their presence reduces chaos. You do not amplify disorder, you absorb it. And because of this, people begin to sense something in you they cannot name. A solidity, finality, a quiet refusal to be pulled into superficial urgency. You are no longer chasing relevance. Relevance begins to find you. This is not success in the conventional sense. It is positioning. The psyche is no longer preparing. It is placing itself for much of your life. You are careful with yourself, not cautious in the practical sense, but morally restrained. You associated force with harm, ambition with corruption, and authority with domination. Somewhere early on, You decided that to remain good, you would remain small. Machiavelli warned that this decision carries a hidden cost. What the psyche refuses to live consciously does not disappear. It sinks into the shadow where it waits, gathers energy, and eventually returns in distorted form. Your restraint was understandable. You were sensitive to consequences. You saw how power deformed people who acquired it too early. So you kept your distance, you observed, you analyzed, you delayed. But delay does not erase capacity. As you move deeper into the second half of life, something changes. The shadow no longer feels like a threat, feels like unfinished business. You begin to notice impatience, not with others, but with your own self-limitation. Tolerance for inefficiency drops. You stop softening truths to protect egos. You feel a subtle irritation with chaos that refuses to organize itself. This is not bitterness, it is the return of strength. Machiavelli believed that true morality is not the absence of aggression, but the containment and direction of it. A person who cannot say no is not virtuous. They are unfinished. After 50, your relationship with aggression evolves. It is no longer reactive, it is deliberate. You do not explode, you apply pressure. This is where your presence changes. You speak less, but when you do, conversation reorganizes. You do not argue. You end debates by naming what others avoid. You do not dominate, you stabilize. The power you carry now is not loud because it is not compensatory. It does not seek validation. It does not need to prove itself. It exists because you are no longer afraid of it. Machiavelli described this as shadow integration, the moment when the psyche stops splitting itself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Energy that was once bound in internal conflict becomes available for action. This is why later life competence feels heavier. You are no longer divided. Earlier in life, your hesitation was not weakness. It was the friction of unintegrated opposites, compassion pulling against authority, insight pulling against action, ethics pulling against ambition. Now those forces align. You no longer confuse dominance with cruelty. You no longer confuse restraint with goodness. You understand that power used consciously is stabilizing, not destructive. This is why you can hold positions others misuse. Leadership no longer intoxicates you. Responsibility no longer frightens you. Influence feels like weight, not reward. And weight requires maturity. Machiavelli believed that people who integrate their shadow later in life become unusually grounded. They are not easily provoked. They do not posture. They do not need enemies to define themselves. This makes them difficult to manipulate. You notice this in subtle ways. You no longer explain yourself to be understood. You allow misunderstanding to exist. You no longer rush to defend your motives. You let outcomes speak. This silence unnerves people accustomed to emotional leverage, and it protects you. You are also less sentimental about relationships, not colder, clearer. You no longer confuse history with obligation. You no longer keep proximity out of guilt. You choose connection based on alignment, not nostalgia. This is shadow integration in action. Machiavelli warned that those who refuse the stage become harmless but resentful. Those who embrace it become formidable but calm. You are becoming the latter not because you seek control, but because you can now contain yourself fully. This is why later life does not weaken you, concentrates you. The chaos that once lived inside has been ordered. An ordered energy does not dissipate. It accumulates. You are no longer waiting to be allowed to exist at full scale. You already do, for most of your life. You were told directly or indirectly that you were unfocused. Too many interests, too many directions, too many abandoned paths. People assumed you lacked discipline, commitment, or ambition. Even you wondered if something was wrong. Why nothing seemed to hold you permanently. Machiavelli saw this pattern clearly. He believed some individuals are not designed to specialize early because their role is not execution. It is integration. While others narrow their focus to become efficient, you widened yours to become coherent. Every subject that caught your attention, every skill you partially developed, every domain you explored and then left behind, none of it was wasted. You were not collecting expertise. You were collecting symbolic material, and symbolic material only reveals its function later. This is why your competence now feels difficult to categorize. You don't fit neatly into titles. Your value is not obvious on paper. But when complexity appears, when systems fail, when situations become ambiguous, you see what others miss. You understand how pieces relate. Machiavelli believed the psyche strives for wholeness, but wholeness cannot be achieved through linear accumulation. It requires exposure to contradiction, overlap and tension across domains. You lived in that tension for decades. This is why later success often looks sudden to outsiders. One year you were underestimated, the next indispensable, but the shift was not sudden. It was cumulative, like sediment. Your experience compressed slowly until it hardened. This is also why your work now carries authority without self-promotion. You don't need to signal competence. People sense it not because you are impressive, but because you are consistent across context. Your thinking holds under pressure. This is rare. Most people are competent within narrow boundaries. Outside those boundaries, they destabilize. You don't. You've lived in ambiguity long enough to treat it as terrain. He is always watching, always learning, always guarding the citadel. The door to the cage is open. You have walked out. Don't walk back in just because you miss the company. Keep walking into the dark, into the deep. That is where the treasure is. If this opened your eyes, understand this is only what I can show publicly. There are videos I cannot upload for everyone. There are aspects of dark psychology that I simply cannot discuss publicly on YouTube without being censored or demonetized. The algorithm suppresses the most powerful information. Those exist behind the join button. If you're still here, you're not like the others. Subscribe if you haven't, but if you want what's hidden, click the join button and step into the architect level. You will unlock exclusive uncensored videos that dive into the deepest parts of the human psyche. Most won't, that's the point. Connect with new update comment below your thoughts.